Good morning. I'm Gabriela Cornejo.
I'm Tiffany Netto.
I'm Niral Jagtap.
I'm Kori Thompson.
And today we'll be discussing Gwendolyn Brooks. So, who was Gwendolyn Brooks? She was a well-known poet and writer from the mid to late 20th century, and she wrote about the Black experience using her own vivid, first-hand experiences, where she wrote about the injustices she faced in her life and growing up in poverty-stricken urban Chicago. She was a poet from a young age. She had her first poem published when she was only 13, and by the time she was 17, she had her poems regularly published in the Chicago Defender. She was well known, clearly, considering she was the first African American to ever win a Pulitzer Prize, which she won for Annie Allen, and she was the first Black woman to hold the position of poetry consultant to the Library of Congress, which is a very high honor. But more than a poet, she was also a social justice advocate. She published works that clearly reflected the ongoing civil rights movements of the 1960s, and she worked together to bring people in the Black community, together. She empowered and inspired people by promoting Black unity. She inspired Black men, women, and children alike. And it is said that Brooks was a significant figure in Black literature and that she was highly regarded, exceedingly influential, and that today her books or her poetry is still used as they're taught in schools. So this kind of led us to the research question of how she was significant and how her writing itself contributed to advancements within Black literature and the ongoing social justice movements that went on in her lifetime. So that we kind of argue that in regard to her poetry, Gwendolyn Brooks' radical shift from the mainstream to the Black arts movement was significant because she actively used her writing to foster Black pride and empowerment rather than the long accepted norms of Black shame and deference. So kind of just for context sake within this, the Black arts movement, if you're not familiar with that, it was started by a group of politically motivated writers, poets, artists, writers, just all sorts of artists, and it emerged following the Black Power movement around 1965. This movement emphasized racial and cultural pride. It was pretty radical for its time, and it's Afrocentric, which means that it was for African Americans, about African Americans, and yeah, pretty much just all about African Americanism. And so what kind of set it aside from other movements was its exceedingly political and militant style of writing.
So as Gabs was saying before, she knew that she wanted to write. She knew that she wanted to be a poet from a very young age. She had her first poem published at 13. She had written about 75 poems by the time she was 16, and she was a very talented poet. And she had very supportive parents as well. They always stressed the importance of reading, education, and writing. And a lot of her early lifestyle led to what her writing was like when she wrote in the beginning. Because she had struggled being accepted because of her dark skin, and she was also a little bit more shy, a little more sensitive. And she also moved to Chicago at a very young age and moved into the neighborhood of Bronxville, which is actually very significant because a lot of her poetry talks about that and talks about being an African American in the city. And so because of this, she used a lot of domestic settings and a lot of proximal areas to talk about African American city life. And this is really important because a lot of poets they kind of expanded what they were saying, but she wrote very specifically about realist ideas, about what was going on in her life, describing what she saw exactly right where she was in her neighborhood of Bronxville in Chicago, in the city. And she was also, this is very important, written to be very likable and relatable to the public. Everyone really knew who she was, knew what she liked, knew how she wrote, liked what she wrote, and that goes into her excerpt, her Annie Allen. This is actually a very famous book that she wrote, and she actually got published for this one. And as you can see in this excerpt, it's very, as it starts off, of dusty rose and brown with little white splashes, white curls, young yellow waiter. She uses very flowery adjectives, a lot of just a lot of like good, sorry. She uses a lot of flowery adjectives to describe what she's seeing, what she's trying to say, and it uses a lot of scholarly and intellectual writing as well. And this kind of describes her very vivid experiences of her childhood life, which is what Annie Allen was about. And she does use a lot of complex wordplay in there to get in the head of like, oh, she does talk about colored people. The colored people will not clown. The colored people arrive. They sit down firmly. But it isn't as much as she dwells on that fact. She just talks about it. She describes it, and it's known to be really very real and relatable. And so for the excerpt we just saw, Annie Allen, she actually got an award for it. She was the first African American to win the Pulitzer Prize for it. And she actually was a very famous poet who won a lot of awards. This one in particular, I would like to talk about. She actually, for Annie Allen, I found this primary source that described why she really won this award. Like what went into the minds of the people, the committee who gave this award to her. They described her as how real she was and how real her poems were. And that was very significant in the fact that she made a great impression on all of her readers. And that's how they did it. In the direct quote, she made a great impression on all of her readers. It was a wide sale, which is not that well known in writing back then. And so everyone enjoyed her writing, and everyone liked to read what she wrote. It was very relatable, it was very real. And she also did not have much self-pity for blacks, which is how they described it, with no grievance or racial criticism as the purpose. Being that she would say that she was black, she would talk about these things, but she wouldn't bluntly go out of her way and say, this is what happens to us, this is what our life is like. She would just mention it as she talked about her poems and her stories.
In direct contrast to what she was doing then, new movements, new political changes were happening in the black communities across the nation. The civil rights movement, of course, as we all know, gave way to the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s promoted things like black nationalism, self-determination, pride, self-sufficiency, and political action, direct political action to achieve the betterment of the black race in the United States. The Black Arts movement directly shot off of this. The Black Arts movement was, as Gabs said, a movement that was by black people, for black people, about black people. And Brooks came into contact with this movement in the late 1960s when she attended the second writers' conference at historically black Fisk University. And at this conference, she saw a lot of poets involved with the Black Arts movement, such as Amiri Baraka. They all presented fiery poems that had a great effect on the audience. She was directly impacted by this. She said that she first came into contact with her race. Her race confronted her directly. It was now an important aspect of her identity rather than a background one. The shift is the term that many critics use for going from relatively mainstream, palatable, acceptable poetry that was appealing to people of all races, people across the nation, to more Afrocentric poetry that parallels the ideas of the Black Arts movement. In the years following 1967, she released many pieces of writing, many collections of poetry, many long pieces of writing that directly were influenced by the Black Arts movement and her experience at the conference at Fisk University. In the Mecca is a collection and a story about a building in her neighborhood that she worked in earlier. And it discussed the dilapidated condition of the building and the decline of her neighborhood where a lot of black people lived. It was very unfortunate for them. Riot, it relates to the riots directly following 1967. Of course, Martin Luther King was assassinated and many people were rioting in anger, direct action. They wanted direct political action, which was one of the ideals of the Black Power and Black Arts movement. And Primer for Blacks, which discusses mainly black pride rather than black shame. She later said that she aimed to call all black readers. Her poetry now had a purpose rather than just being observant of the world around her. Her poetry aimed to call Black readers from all walks of life in order to promote their own well-being, their own self-sufficiency, their self-love, and their own real emancipation, quote, real emancipation. This directly contrasted in her work, of course, prior to 1967, like Annie Allen, Maud Martha, another novel by her. These didn't have political aim. Her poetry did have a rhetorical purpose, whether or not she actually made arguments in it. Her poetry presented the ability to interpret it. She wrote a lot of, say, satirical work. She wrote direct, blunt work. This poem, Riot, is a poem by Brooks that was released in about 1970. It starts off with the MLK Jr. quote that riot is the language of the unheard. The unheard were the Black people, and the Black arts movement directly promoted political action, such as maybe riots, almost. John Cabot was an explorer. She named her character in the poem after this white explorer to represent racism in the United States. And this racism in the United States was directly attacked by people, by Negroes coming down the street. They came toward him in rough ranks, in C's and windsweep. They directly represented the ideas like Black empowerment, Black direct political action. And embracing Black culture comes in the second column. John Cabot, she presents him satirically, and he says, "Don't let it touch me, the blackness, Lord." But they come toward him with the fume of pigfoot, chittering, and cheap chili, like Black foods, Black culture. She aimed to promote the ideas of the Black arts movement by writing about Black culture. These are Black cultural foods. Next.
So to emphasize the distinction between her pre and post works, we'll be doing like an in-depth analysis of her later poem, Primer for Blacks. One of the first things to note is what the meaning of this poem is. The first thing is that it's directly appealing to any African American person who tries to align himself with another group in society that's less marginalized. For example, Native Americans, even though they were mistreated, they weren't mistreated to the same extent. She's calling for African Americans to take pride in their heritage as one of the first ways to incite change. Another thing to notice is the word "you." She says "you" multiple times. This is a very clear change in audience. Prior to the shift, she was talking to the direct public, or to the general public, and that's why she got the Pulitzer Prize. She was appealing to everyone liked her, she spoke to all races. Whereas after the shift, she's very clearly only speaking to African Americans. She doesn't care what her white audience thinks anymore. She's completely disregarded them, and she's solely focusing on her Black audience. This is very characteristic of the Black arts movement, in that it's for Blacks celebrating African Americans, and it's really all about their culture. It has nothing to do with any other race. Another thing to notice is, if you compare this work to Annie Allen, we saw Annie Allen at the beginning. It used a lot of flowery language, a lot of metaphors, a lot of ways of, writing in a very intellectual sort of way. Whereas this is extremely blunt, it's direct, it's straight to the point, and it completely ignores any sense of metaphor or flowery language. It's almost as if these are two different writers. Another thing to note is the title. This might seem like an overly specific detail, but the title of the poem is important. The word primer has two meanings. You can see in the left picture. The New England Primer was essentially a school book used to teach kids how to read. It's like a very elementary book, and it's like the base of your knowledge. And primer is also something used to prepare things that you're about to paint. It might not seem important, but it actually has a meaning in that she's saying that the fundamental way to start change and to advocate for social justice is to take pride in who you are and what your heritage is. There is definitely a sense of whiteness being superior in this time, and so she's asking African Americans, how do you expect to create change if you on some level agree with that? If you agree that whiteness is superior and that you are inferior by aligning yourself with a different group. Another thing to notice within that is the historical context. In the second picture, you can see that these people are trying to pass as white
Langston Hughes actually wrote a good story called Passing, which is about the same thing. Basically, this is literally trying to remove yourself from your culture by passing as white so you can get these same sort of social benefits. And so obviously Brooks is completely against this. So within this title, Primer for Blacks, you can see that there's a clear distinction between her pre-shift work and her post-shift work, to the point where it's almost like two different authors. But yeah, this point further emphasizes how she aligns herself with the Black arts movement and how she's calling for Black pride and to celebrate Black culture.
So from this, you can clearly see that Brooks was a major inspiration to not only just the Black community, but to other Black authors specifically. And this was kind of because of her unique style of poetry, which was characterized by traits such as an almost nationalistic perspective on Black identity and culture, and by writing mostly about women. So Courtney Thorson discusses this in her scholarly journal article entitled Gwendolyn Brooks's Black Aesthetic of the Domestic, where she kind of goes into detail about how Brooks may have aligned herself with the Black arts movement style of poetry, but she still kept her own unique style by discussing and exploring topics that not everyone touched on in their work, such as writing predominantly about the struggles and lives of Black women. So she didn't exactly follow kind of like the rigid framework the Black arts movement established about Black gender politics. She went off of that, and that kind of allowed for other 20th century writers to take inspiration from there and also discuss other topics that were not always discussed in detail, and instead of writing generally about the Black struggle, going into specifics. And so her deliberate shift in writing style kind of emphasizes this, how she was calling for Black unity and empowerment and fostering that sense of Black pride. And so she wanted kind of to, I guess she was kind of pushing for other writers to do the same thing in that sense. And so this is why we think that she was significant, or it's believed she's known to be significant and highly regarded because of this. She tried to bring together the Black community, and she decided to step away from being shameful of who she was and encouraged others to do the same, and to celebrate their Blackness. It is because of this that she is significant, and she kind of helped push along the evolution of Black literature.